September 14th, 1942. Just 200 hours. The east bank of the Volga River. Major General Alexander Rodimtsev stood on the muddy shore, watching the fires of Stalingrad paint the night sky orange. Behind him, 10,000 men of the 13th Guards Rifle Division waited in silence, their faces illuminated by the glow of a dying city. Across 400 yards of black water, the German 6th Army was grinding through the final Soviet defenders, street by street, building by building, body by body. Within hours, the swastika would fly over the city that bore Stalin's name, and the Wehrmacht would claim its greatest victory on the Eastern Front. What neither Rodimtsev nor the German commanders knew was that these 10,000 guardsmen crossing the Volga that night would transform Stalingrad from a German triumph into a Soviet legend. The Guards units, elite formations forged in blood during the desperate retreats of 1941, were about to demonstrate what motivated, well-trained soldiers could achieve even in the most hopeless circumstances. This is the story of how the Soviet Guards entered Stalingrad, how they fought when defeat seemed certain, and how they turned Hitler's greatest offensive into his most catastrophic failure. The Soviet Guards designation wasn't propaganda, it was earned in fire. After the catastrophic losses of Operation Barbarossa in summer 1941, Stalin needed something to restore morale, to prove that Soviet soldiers could match the Wehrmacht. On September 18th, 1941, he issued Order No. 308, creating the Guards system. Only units that had distinguished themselves in combat, that had held when others broke, that had achieved the impossible, would receive the Guards title. The 100th Rifle Division, which had stopped the Germans at Yelnya, became the 1st Guards Rifle Division. The 127th Rifle Division, blooded in the defence of Smolensk, became the 2nd Guards. Each Guards formation received better equipment, higher pay, distinctive uniforms, and above all the expectation that they would fight harder than anyone else. By September 1942, there were 18 Guards Rifle Divisions in the Red Army. Each had proven itself in the apocalyptic battles of the previous year. These weren't the frightened conscripts of 1941, surrendering in entire armies. These were veterans who had learned to fight the Wehrmacht and survive. Alexander Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Rifle Division had been the 87th Rifle Division until December 1941, when they earned their Guards title defending Moscow. They had fought at Kursk, at Vyazma, through the frozen hell of the winter counter-offensive. They knew the Germans, knew their tactics, knew that Wehrmacht invincibility was a myth maintained by superior organisation and firepower. But they also knew something else. In close combat, in ruins where tanks couldn't manoeuvre and artillery couldn't observe, training and courage mattered more than equipment. Stalingrad would be that kind of battle. The situation in Stalingrad on September 14th was desperate beyond Western comprehension. The German 6th Army, 250,000 men under General Friedrich Paulus, had been attacking since August 23rd. They had driven through the industrial suburbs, crushed Soviet counterattacks, and now controlled 90% of the city. The remaining Soviet forces, primarily the battered 62nd Army under General Vasily Chuikov, held a strip of ruins along the Volga, sometimes only 200 yards deep. German troops were literally meters from the river in places. One more push, German commanders believed, and the city would fall. Chuikov had arrived to take command on September the 12th, finding an army that had ceased to exist as an organised force. Units were scattered, communication was impossible. Supply lines across the Volga were under constant artillery fire. Soldiers were fighting in isolated groups, often without knowing if anyone else was still alive. The Germans attacked with combined arms, tanks and infantry supported by Stukas, methodically reducing each building to rubble. Soviet tactics of defence in depth, of organised withdrawal to prepared positions, were impossible in this environment. There was nowhere to withdraw to. The Volga was at their backs. What Chuikov understood, what would become the foundation of Soviet tactics in Stalingrad, was that the Germans' greatest advantages disappeared in ruins. Their artillery, so devastating in open terrain, couldn't be used close to their own troops. Their tanks, invincible on the steppes, were helpless in rubble-choked streets. Their air power, which had terrorised Soviet armies for over a year, couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the smoke and chaos of urban combat. If Soviet troops could get close enough to the Germans, close enough to grab them by the belt, as Chuikov would say, then it became a contest of will and skill, not of equipment and firepower. That's where the Guards would make their stand. The Volga crossing was itself an act of madness. The river at Stalingrad is over 400 yards wide, a vast expanse of dark water that offered no cover. German artillery observers on the high ground west of the city had perfect visibility of the eastern bank. Machine gun positions covered the landing zones. The Luftwaffe flew constant patrols. Soviet ferries, fishing boats, barges, anything that could float had been pressed into service. Most wouldn't survive their first trip, yet there was no alternative. The 13th Guards had to cross, had to reach the city, or the 62nd Army would be destroyed by dawn. Rodimtsev's orders were simple and impossible. Cross the Volga under fire, land in the city centre where German troops were already at the riverbank, secure a foothold and hold until relieved. No one could say when relief would come, or if it would come at all. The division's heavy equipment, its artillery and vehicles would have to be left behind. The Guardsmen would cross with their rifles, machine guns and whatever ammunition they could carry. Once across, they would be cut off, surrounded, fighting with their backs to the river. Standard military doctrine considered such a situation hopeless. Soviet doctrine in 1942 increasingly ignored standard military doctrine. At 300 hours, the first boats pushed off from the eastern shore. They carried the 1st Battalion of the 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment, 600 men commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Elin. The plan was to land at the central ferry terminal directly below Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that dominated the city. German intelligence had identified the 62nd Army headquarters in this area, making it the focus of their attack. Landing there meant immediate combat, but it also meant reinforcing the most critical sector. The boats moved slowly, oars muffled with rags, motors silent. For 10 minutes, there was only the sound of water and distant explosions. Then the night erupted. German artillery observers had been waiting. Flares burst over the river, turning night into harsh white daylight. Machine guns opened up from the western shore, tracers creating curtains of fire across the water. Mortars began dropping shells among the boats, throwing up geysers of water and shrapnel. The lead boats accelerated, motors roaring, racing for the landing zone as men died around them. One boat took a direct hit and simply disappeared. 40 men gone in an instant. Another caught fire, the screams of burning soldiers audible over the gunfire. The rest pushed on because there was nowhere else to go. Lieutenant Alexei Kravchenko, a platoon commander in the 1st Battalion, later described the crossing in his memoirs. The boat next to us exploded. One moment it was there, full of men I'd known for a year. The next it was gone, just burning debris on the water. Bullets were hitting the water like rain. You could hear them smacking into the hull, into the men around you. The sergeant next to me was hit in the head. He fell forward without a sound. We couldn't stop to help anyone. You just held your rifle and waited to die or reach the shore. Both seemed equally impossible. The first boats reached the western shore at 03:15 hours. The landing zone was a nightmare of fire and steel. German machine guns, positioned in the ruins of buildings at the water's edge, had perfect fields of fire across the exposed riverbank. The Guardsmen had to cross 50 yards of open ground, littered with the bodies from previous crossing attempts, before reaching any cover. They went in waves, small groups sprinting from the boats while others provided covering fire. The casualties were horrific. The first company lost half its strength in the first 5 minutes. But they reached the ruins, and once in the ruins, Soviet soldiers became different creatures. Close combat was something the Red Army had learned to excel at through brutal necessity. In 1941, Soviet soldiers had been taught to attack in massed waves, to rely on artillery preparation and armoured support. The Wehrmacht had slaughtered them. By 1942, the survivors had developed different tactics, learned through experience what the training manuals never taught. In ruins, you moved in small groups, never more than 5 men. You never went through doors, you went through walls, blown open with grenades or satchel charges. You never silhouetted yourself in windows. You threw grenades first and asked questions later. You assumed every building was occupied, every shadow hidden enemy, every moment might be your last. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat warfare. The Soviets called it survival. The 1st Battalion's landing drew German attention away from the follow-on waves. While German troops concentrated on eliminating the Guardsmen in the riverside ruins, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions crossed with lighter casualties. By 0400 hours, 2,000 men of the 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment were ashore and fighting through the destroyed buildings toward their objective, the Central Railway Station number 1. This station had changed hands 15 times in the previous week. Its ruins, a maze of collapsed platforms, overturned railcars and shattered buildings, formed a natural fortress in the centre of the city. Whoever held the station controlled movement through central Stalingrad. The Germans knew this, which is why they had a reinforced company of the 71st Infantry Division dug in among the ruins, supported by tanks and assault guns. The attack on the railway station began at dawn. Major Chernobyv, commanding the 2nd Battalion, decided on a direct assault rather than trying to outflank the position. In Stalingrad's rubble, outflanking was often impossible. Buildings that looked intact on maps were impassable ruins in reality. The only way forward was through. The battalion formed up in the ruins 100 yards from the station, organised into assault groups of 8 to 10 men. Each group had a specific task: one squad with rifles and grenades to provide covering fire, one squad with submachine guns to lead the assault, one squad with anti-tank rifles to deal with German armour, one man with a satchel charge to blow obstacles. The whole thing choreographed through days of practice, because in close combat, hesitation meant death. At 0530 hours, Soviet artillery on the eastern shore opened fire. The barrage was brief, just 2 minutes, but concentrated on the German positions in and around the station. The moment the shells stopped falling, the assault groups went forward. They didn't charge blindly, they moved from cover to cover using rubble, wrecked vehicles, shell craters. When German machine guns opened up, the covering squads suppressed them with concentrated rifle fire, while the assault squads closed in. Grenades flew into German positions, the distinctive crack of Soviet RGD-33s mixing with the sharper bang of German steel hand granites. The submachine gunners, armed with PPSH-41s with 71-round drum magazines, sprayed bullets into any opening, any shadow, any movement. The Germans fought back with the disciplined ferocity that had carried them across Europe. Their MG-42 machine guns, firing at 200 rounds per minute, created interlocking fields of fire that should have stopped any assault. Their Mauser rifles, in the hands of veterans who had been fighting for 3 years, were devastatingly accurate. When the Soviets breached the outer defences, German troops fell back to prepared positions deeper in the ruins, forcing the guardsmen to fight for every room, every corridor, every pile of rubble. A Panzer III tank, positioned behind overturned railcars, began firing high-explosive shells point-blank into buildings where Soviet troops had taken cover, bringing down already damaged structures in clouds of dust and screams. Private Ivan Pavlov, who would later earn immortality defending a different building, was part of the assault on the station. His account, recorded decades later, captured the insanity of the fighting. You couldn't see more than 20 meters through the smoke and dust. You moved by instinct, by sound. You heard German voices, you threw a grenade toward them. You saw movement, you fired. One of our men was shot by another Soviet soldier who thought he was German. It happened all the time. The noise was constant, deafening. Guns, grenades, buildings collapsing, men screaming. You stopped thinking. You just reacted. I saw a German soldier not 5 meters away. We both raised our rifles at the same time. I don't know who fired first, but he fell and I didn't. That's combat. Luck and reaction time. By 0700 hours, the 2nd Battalion had cleared the western edge of the station complex, killing or capturing 60 German soldiers for the loss of 90 guardsmen. But the main station building, a massive pre-war structure now reduced to walls and rubble, still held German troops. Worse, German reinforcements were arriving, troops from the 295th Infantry Division, who had been attacking other sectors. The Soviets heard tank engines, saw infantry forming up for a counterattack. If the Germans retook the station, the entire bridgehead would collapse. Chuikov, commanding from his bunker 400 yards away, radioed Rodimtsev. The station must be held at any cost. Any cost meant exactly what it sounded like. The German counterattack came at 0800 hours with textbook precision. 3 Panzer IIIs and a Panzer IV advanced down Sovietskaya Street, their main guns firing into Soviet positions while infantry followed behind. Stukas appeared overhead, their screaming sirens adding to the psychological assault before they released their bombs. The station building shook from near misses, already weakened walls collapsing further. The Soviet defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, did what Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad learned to do. They got closer. Anti-tank rifles, the PTR D-41s carried by specialized teams, couldn't penetrate a panzer's front armor. But at close range they could damage tracks, periscopes, gun mantelets. The Soviet anti-tank teams let the German tanks advance into the rubble around the station, then opened fire from the flanks at ranges of 30 to 50 meters. The lead Panzer III threw a track and slewed sideways, blocking the street. Its crew, knowing that a disabled tank in Soviet-held ruins was a death trap, began bailing out. They were cut down by submachine gun fire before they reached cover. The other tanks, unable to advance past the wreck and unwilling to reverse into what might be an ambush, began firing blindly into buildings, trying to suppress the Soviet anti-tank teams. That's when the Guardsmen demonstrated the tactic that would define Stalingrad combat. Soldiers armed with Molotov cocktails, bottles filled with gasoline and thickened with tar or soap, crawled through the rubble toward the German tanks. It was suicidally dangerous. Tank machine guns were sweeping the area, German infantry was providing security. One burst of fire would kill you instantly. But in heavy rubble, with smoke and dust obscuring vision, it was possible to get close if you were brave enough or crazy enough. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, not the same Pavlov who would defend the famous house, crawled to within 10 meters of a Panzer IV, rose from cover, and threw 2 Molotov cocktails in quick succession. The first shattered against the engine deck, spreading burning fuel across the rear of the tank. The second went through the open commander's hatch. The tank crew bailed out through the flames and were killed immediately. The remaining German tank reversed rapidly back down the street, its infantry support falling back with it. By noon on September 14th, the railway station was firmly in Soviet hands, but at catastrophic cost. The 2nd Battalion had started the day with 600 men. By 1200 hours it had 280 effectives. Every company commander was dead or wounded. The battalion executive officer was commanding what remained. The 1st and 3rd Battalions, fighting through other sectors to expand the bridgehead, had suffered similar casualties. In 10 hours of combat, the 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment had lost over 1,000 men, nearly 40% of its strength. By any reasonable military standard, the regiment should have been pulled out of combat, reorganized, reinforced, but there was nowhere to pull back to, no reserves to replace them, and the Germans were already preparing another attack. German records from September 14th show confusion and growing concern. The 6th Army had been so close to victory, so close to eliminating the last Soviet resistance. The sudden appearance of fresh Soviet troops, well-trained troops who fought with skill and determination the Germans hadn't seen from defenders in weeks, was unexpected. The 71st Infantry Division's war diary noted, "New enemy forces identified, Soviet Guards. Quality significantly higher than previously encountered units. Attack on railway station repulsed with heavy losses. Enemy demonstrates improved small unit tactics and willingness to fight at close quarters." While the 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment fought for the railway station, the rest of the 13th Guards Division was crossing the Volga and deploying throughout the Soviet-held sector. The 34th Guards Rifle Regiment landed north of the central ferry and attacked toward Mamayev Kurgan, the dominating hill that both sides recognized as key terrain. The 39th Guards Rifle Regiment crossed to the south, reinforcing the approaches to the grain elevator, another critical position. By evening of September 14th, the entire division, minus its heavy equipment, was across the river and in combat. Rodimtsev established his command post in the ruins of a school building 150 yards from the Volga, close enough to hear bullets striking the river embankment. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. If they couldn't prevent Soviet reinforcements from crossing, they would destroy them once they landed. On the night of September 14th-15th, the Luftwaffe flew over 600 sorties against Soviet positions in Stalingrad and the crossing sites on the Volga. Junkers Ju-88 bombers dropped everything from high explosive to incendiaries, turning entire blocks into infernos. The river itself became a killing zone, lit by flares and burning buildings swept by artillery fire. One ferry carrying ammunition took a direct hit and exploded with enough force to shatter windows on the eastern shore. Yet, the crossings continued because they had to. The 13th Guards needed supplies, ammunition, reinforcements for their horrific casualties. Hundreds of trips were made each night, and hundreds of sailors and boatmen died making them. September 15th brought the first major German counterattack against the Guards' bridgehead. The 71st Infantry Division, reinforced with elements of the 295th Infantry Division, and supported by the 24th Panzer Division's remaining tanks, attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. Their objective was to split the Soviet bridgehead, drive to the river, and eliminate the Guards' units piecemeal. The Germans had numbers, armour, air support, and artillery. What they didn't have was experience fighting the kind of close-quarters battle the Soviets were imposing on them. The battle for the railway station resumed at dawn with a German artillery barrage that lasted 30 minutes, hundreds of shells turning what remained of the station into a landscape from hell. The Guardsmen endured in cellars, in foxholes, in any cover they could find, knowing that the barrage meant an attack was coming. When the shells stopped, they emerged and prepared to fight. The German infantry attacked with flamethrowers, trying to burn the Soviets out of positions that couldn't be destroyed by conventional weapons. The liquid fire was terrifying. Men caught in its spray died screaming, but the weapon had limited range and required the operator to get dangerously close. Soviet snipers and machine gunners targeted the flamethrower team specifically, knowing that a hit on the fuel tanks would immolate the operator and anyone nearby. Sergeant Yakov Svinin's platoon held a section of the station's basement, a maze of rubble-choked rooms and corridors. His account of September 15th's fighting showed what combat in Stalingrad truly meant. The Germans attacked 6 times that day. They'd blow a hole in the wall with explosives, throw in grenades, then rush in with submachine guns. We'd fall back to another room, block the doorway with debris and make them do it again. You couldn't hold any position permanently. You fought, fell back, fought again. We ran out of grenades by noon, started throwing bricks and steel fragments. Anything that might hurt or distract them. One of my men, Korpakov, was wounded in the morning, shot through the leg. He kept fighting until the afternoon when he was hit again, this time in the chest. He was still alive when we pulled him into the deepest cellar. He died that night. We couldn't evacuate wounded during the day, too much fire. At night, if you were lucky, stretcher bearers might get to you. Korpakov wasn't lucky. The fighting seesawed through the day. The Germans would capture a room or corridor, then be driven out by a Soviet counterattack. The Soviets would retake lost ground, then lose it again to the next German assault. By evening, both sides were exhausted, down to handfuls of effective soldiers, but neither would yield. The railway station had become symbolic, a place where the outcome of Stalingrad would be decided in microcosm. If the Germans could take it back, they could split the Soviet bridgehead. If the Soviets could hold it, they could survive another day. That binary calculus would define every position in Stalingrad. The breakthrough moment came on September 16th, not at the railway station but at Mamayev Kurgan. This hill, 102 metres high, dominated the entire city. Whoever controlled it could observe enemy movements, direct artillery fire, and command the approaches to the river crossings. The Germans had held it for weeks, using it to devastate Soviet positions. The 34th Guards Rifle Regiment had been attacking the hill since September 14th, gaining and losing ground in brutal close combat. On the morning of September 16th, they tried a different approach. Instead of attacking uphill into German positions, they infiltrated up the steep ravines on the hill's northern slope, moving at night in small groups. By dawn, they had 200 men on the hill summit, behind the main German defensive line. The Germans, expecting attacks from the south and east, suddenly found Soviet troops in their rear. The hill's defenders, caught between the infiltrators on top and a frontal assault by the rest of the regiment, broke. By 1000 hours on September 16th, the Soviet flag flew from Mamayev Kurgan's summit for the first time since the battle began. The German reaction was savage. Paulus recognized that losing the Kurgan meant losing observation over the entire northern sector. He committed elements of 3 divisions to retake the hill immediately. Throughout September 16th and 17th, German troops attacked repeatedly, sometimes gaining the summit only to be driven off by Soviet counterattacks. The hilltop became a slaughterhouse. There was no cover on the exposed slopes, no protection from artillery and mortar fire that both sides called down almost continuously. The soil, when examined after the war, contained more steel from shell fragments than earth. Trees were reduced to splinters. The few buildings were ground into dust. Lieutenant Nikolai Ozerov, a platoon commander in the 34th Guards, described the hill fighting. You couldn't dig in, the ground was too hard, too much rock and steel. You found shell holes and huddled in them until you had to move or attack. The casualties were unbelievable. My platoon started with 43 men. After 2 days on the hill, I had 11. We held a trench line on the northern slope, maybe 50 metres long. The Germans were in their trench 30 metres away. We threw grenades at each other for hours. When you ran out of grenades, you threw rocks. When you ran out of rocks, you waited for them to attack and shot them. At night, both sides sent out patrols to recover wounded and retrieve weapons from the dead. You'd hear them out there, crawling through the darkness. Sometimes you'd run into German patrols and have these brief, desperate knife fights in the dark. Come dawn, you'd see the bodies scattered between the trenches and know you'd have to do it all again. While the Guards fought for Mamev Kurgan, the rest of the 13th Guards Division was expanding and consolidating the bridgehead. The 39th Guards Rifle Regiment captured and held the ruins of the Red October Factory's administrative buildings, creating a strong point on the division's southern flank. The 42nd Guards, after losing and retaking the railway station 3 more times, finally established a defensive perimeter that the Germans couldn't crack. Each regiment was now at 50% strength or less, but they held their ground. More importantly, they had stopped the German advance. For the first time since August, the Wehrmacht was not gaining ground in Stalingrad. The arrival of the Guards began transforming 62nd Army tactics. Chuikov recognized that what worked for Rodimtsev's division could work throughout the army. Small unit tactics, aggressive close combat, constant counterattacks to keep the Germans off balance. He issued orders codifying what the Guards had demonstrated. Soviet units would dig in as close to German positions as possible, sometimes 20 to 30 meters away. This proximity made it impossible for the Germans to use their artillery and air power without hitting their own troops. It forced combat into the close-quarters battle where Soviet soldiers, fighting with desperation and increasingly effective tactics, could compete on equal terms. The concept of storm groups was formalized. Each group, 6 to 8 men, would include a mix of weapons. Submachine gunners for close combat, riflemen for covering fire, a soldier with anti-tank grenades or Molotov cocktails, another with a satchel charge for demolitions. These groups learned to fight independently, to move through rubble using covered approaches, to attack from unexpected directions. German tactical superiority, which relied on coordinated combined arms operations, broke down in this environment. You couldn't coordinate armour, artillery and infantry when the enemy was close enough to throw rocks at you. Soviet snipers became a particular terror for German troops. In ruins where movement drew instant fire, where visibility was limited by smoke and rubble, skilled marksmen with scoped rifles were deadly. The most famous, Vasily Zaitsev, arrived in Stalingrad in September and began accumulating his legendary kill total. But he was one of many. The 13th Guards Division alone had over 40 trained snipers, and they taught others, German officers and NCOs. Identifiable by their insignia and behaviour were priority targets. Killing leaders disrupted German unit cohesion, made their attacks less coordinated, forced junior soldiers to make decisions they weren't trained for. By September 22nd, 8 days after the 13th Guards arrived, the situation in Stalingrad had stabilized. The Germans still held most of the city, still had overwhelming superiority in equipment and firepower, but they were no longer advancing toward victory. Every block they captured cost dozens of casualties. Every building they cleared might be reoccupied by Soviet troops the next night. The blitzkrieg tactics that had conquered Poland, France, and most of European Russia were useless in Stalingrad's ruins. The Wehrmacht was being dragged into exactly the kind of attritional urban battle it couldn't win. German casualties were mounting to unsustainable levels. The Sixth Army had taken relatively light losses during the advance across the steppes, but now companies were being reduced to 30 or 40 men in days of city fighting. Fresh replacements, arriving from training depots in Germany, were dying within hours of entering combat, killed before they learned the brutal lessons of urban warfare. Veteran soldiers, survivors of years of combat on multiple fronts, were falling to Soviet grenades and bullets in anonymous ruins. The 71st Infantry Division, which had attacked the railway station on September 14th with 9,000 men, was down to 5,000 effectives by September 25th. More Guards divisions followed the 13th across the Volga. The 37th Guards Rifle Division arrived on September 20th, immediately thrown into combat on the northern edge of the Soviet perimeter. The 95th Rifle Division, upgraded to Guard status for its performance at Stalingrad, reinforced the centre. Each new division brought fresh troops, more firepower, and the increasingly refined tactics of close combat. The Germans found themselves fighting not demoralised stragglers, but elite units that contested every metre. The psychological impact on German troops was significant. Letters home, intercepted by Soviet intelligence, showed growing disillusionment. A corporal in the 389th Infantry Division wrote, "We thought the Russians were beaten, that Stalingrad would fall in days. Now we fight for individual rooms and lose men we can't replace. The new Soviet troops fight like demons. They don't retreat, they don't surrender. They just keep fighting even when surrounded and out of ammunition. You kill them and more appear. We're winning battles but losing the war." October brought a shift in German tactics. Recognizing that broad attacks gained little ground at high cost, Paulus ordered concentrated assaults on key positions. The factory district in northern Stalingrad, with its massive industrial complexes, became the focus. The Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the Barricadi ordnance factory, and the Red October steel plant were giant fortresses of steel and concrete, perfect for defence. The Germans attacked with everything they had, supported by every available aircraft and artillery piece. The battles that followed through October and November would be among the most savage in military history. The 13th Guards, reduced to less than 3,000 effectives from its original 10,000, was pulled back to the Volga's edge for rest and rebuilding. They had accomplished their mission. They had stopped the German advance, stabilised the bridgehead, and proven that the Wehrmacht could be fought to a standstill. Their casualties, over 70%, were horrific but not unusual for Stalingrad. Every unit that fought in the city suffered similar losses. The difference was that Soviet units could be rebuilt with replacements ferried across the Volga. German units, deep in enemy territory at the end of a 1,000-mile supply line, could not. The true significance of the Guards' intervention wouldn't be clear until November, when the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, smashed through Romanian armies on the flanks and encircled the entire German Sixth Army. But the seeds of that encirclement were planted in September, when the Guards divisions crossed the Volga and refused to let Stalingrad fall. By holding the city, they tied down German forces that could have been used elsewhere, allowed the Soviets time to prepare their counteroffensive, and demonstrated that the Red Army had learned to fight the Wehrmacht on equal terms. The defensive battle for Stalingrad from September to November 1942 cost the Red Army approximately 500,000 casualties, including killed, wounded and missing. The 62nd Army, which bore the brunt of the fighting, was rebuilt 3 times over, units reduced to handfuls of survivors, then brought back up to strength with replacements. The Guards divisions, elite formations that were supposed to be preserved for crucial moments, were ground down like any other unit because every moment in Stalingrad was crucial. But they held. Through September, through October, through November, Soviet troops clung to their strip of ruins along the Volga. When Operation Uranus launched on November 19th, when Soviet tank armies smashed through the flanks and closed the trap around the Sixth Army, it was possible because the defenders of Stalingrad had refused to break. The Guards divisions that crossed the Volga in September had bought time with their blood, and that time proved sufficient. The German soldiers trapped in the Stalingrad pocket in November understood what had happened. They had been so close to victory, could see the Volga from their positions, knew that one more push might have ended it, but that push never came because the Guards wouldn't let it come. In the frozen hell of the Stalingrad encirclement, where 250,000 German soldiers would die or surrender over the next 3 months, veterans remembered the days in September when Soviet Guards first appeared in the ruins. That's when we lost, they said. We didn't know it then, but that's when the war turned. After the war, Alexander Rodimtsev, who would rise to command a corps and retire as a general, was asked about the crossing of September 14th. His response captured what the Guards had accomplished. We knew we might not survive. The odds were impossible. We were crossing under fire to attack an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned us, with no support and no escape route. But we also knew that if we didn't make that crossing, Stalingrad would fall, and if Stalingrad fell, perhaps the war would be lost. So we crossed. Men died. But enough lived to fight, and that was sufficient. The Guard's title wasn't just decoration. It was a promise. That we would go where others couldn't, fight when others wouldn't, hold when others broke. At Stalingrad, we kept that promise. In the Red Army Museum in Moscow, there's a display dedicated to the 13th Guards Rifle Division. It shows their route of march from Moscow to Stalingrad, lists their battle honours, names their heroes. At the centre is a photograph from September 1942, showing guardsmen crossing the Volga at night, the sky behind them orange with fire, their faces set with the knowledge of what awaited on the far shore. Below the photograph is a quote from a German officer's diary, captured when the 6th Army surrendered. September 14th, 1942. Soviet Guards crossed the Volga today. We thought the battle was won. We were wrong. The Soviet Guards units entered Stalingrad when defeat seemed certain and victory impossible. They fought in ruins where every building was a fortress and every street a killing zone. They suffered casualties that would have destroyed most military formations and kept fighting. They demonstrated that motivation, training and courage could overcome material disadvantage, that desperate men with rifles could stop an army that had conquered a continent. The German 6th Army would remain trapped in Stalingrad's ruins until its surrender on February 2, 1943. But the battle was decided in September, in the first desperate days after the Guards crossed the Volga, when the Wehrmacht discovered that Soviet soldiers would no longer break, would no longer retreat, would die in place before yielding another metre of ground. The thunder of German artillery that had echoed across Europe since 1939 was answered in Stalingrad by the thunder of Soviet resistance, and in that thunder the outcome of the war was written. The transformation of Soviet tactics in Stalingrad went far beyond what the 13th Guards Division demonstrated in those first desperate days. By October 1942, the entire 62nd Army had adopted and refined the close combat methods that proved effective against German combined arms superiority. What emerged was a comprehensive system of urban warfare that would influence military doctrine for generations. The backbone of this system was the Storm Group, but its implementation was far more sophisticated than simple small unit tactics. Each Storm Group was tailored to its specific mission. Groups attacking fortified buildings had different compositions than those defending positions or conducting night raids. A typical assault storm group might include 10 to 12 men with a carefully balanced mix of weapons. 2 submachine gunners with PPSH-41s would lead, their high rate of fire suppressing enemy positions during the initial breach. Behind them came riflemen with Mosin Nagant rifles, providing accurate covering fire. A soldier carrying a satchel charge of 10 to 15 pounds of explosives could blast through walls or barricades. Another carried Molotov cocktails or anti-tank grenades for dealing with German armour. A light machine gunner with a DP-28 provided sustained fire support. Often a sniper accompanied the group, tasked with eliminating German observers and commanders during the assault. These groups didn't operate in isolation. Multiple storm groups would coordinate attacks on single objectives, each approaching from different directions to split German defensive fire. Supporting groups would provide covering fire from adjacent buildings, suppress known German positions, and be ready to exploit success or cover withdrawal. The coordination required constant communication, but traditional radios were useless in the rubble and chaos. The Soviets adapted by using runners, visual signals, and predetermined timetables. If Group 1 was supposed to attack at exactly 600 hours, Group 2 would attack at 603, assuming Group 1 had engaged the enemy's attention, crude but effective. The weapons themselves evolved for urban combat. The standard Mosin Nagant rifle, with its 29-inch barrel, was too long for fighting in confined spaces. Soldiers began removing the stocks and cutting down barrels, creating makeshift carbines. Commanders initially punished this as destruction of state property until they realized the modified weapons were more effective. Eventually, official modifications were authorized. The PPSH-41 submachine gun became the weapon of choice for urban combat, its 71-round drum magazine allowing sustained fire in the close-range engagements that characterized Stalingrad fighting. Soldiers learned to tape 2 drums together for faster reloading, creating a crude but effective quick-change system. Grenades became the primary weapon in many situations. The standard RGD-33 defensive grenade had limited fragmentation but good blast effect. soldiers learned to bundle multiple grenades together with wire, creating improvised demolition charges. The RPG-40 anti-tank grenade, designed to penetrate armour, proved equally effective at blowing holes through walls and floors. Soviet troops developed tactics of vertical assault, attacking through floors and ceilings rather than through doors and windows where Germans expected them. A soldier would place a satchel charge or bundled grenades against a ceiling, blow a hole through to the floor above, then immediately throw grenades through the opening before the dust settled. The assault team would follow, catching defenders from an unexpected direction. The Germans tried to counter these tactics with their own innovations. They reinforced buildings with concrete and steel, created interlocking fields of fire, mined approaches. They used their famous MG-42 machine guns, with their incredible 1-200 rounds per minute rate of fire, to sweep likely avenues of approach. They positioned snipers in concealed positions to pick off Soviet storm group leaders. They brought in flamethrowers, tried to burn defenders out of positions that couldn't be taken by conventional assault. None of it was enough, because the fundamental mathematics of urban combat favoured the defender, and the Soviets were willing to pay the attacker's price. Lieutenant Anatoly Mereshko, serving as an operations officer in 62nd Army Headquarters, witnessed the evolution of tactics firsthand. His post-war memoirs provided insight into how Soviet commanders thought about the battle. Chuikov understood something the Germans never grasped. In urban combat, the side willing to fight at closer range wins. If the Germans wanted to engage at 100 metres, we closed to 50. If they pulled back to 50, we closed to 25. At arm's length, their artillery, tanks and air power meant nothing. It became a contest of will, and we had desperation on our side. Every metre of ground we yielded brought them closer to the Volga, closer to cutting us off from supply and reinforcement. We literally had our backs to the river. There was no retreat, no manoeuvre, just hold or die. That kind of desperation is a powerful motivator. The Soviets also exploited the psychological dimension of urban warfare. They used the darkness, the ruins, the constant uncertainty to create fear among German troops. Snipers would wound rather than kill when possible, knowing that wounded soldiers required 2 or 3 men to evacuate them, removing combatants from the line. Soviet troops would infiltrate German positions at night, kill sentries silently with knives, leave bodies where they'd be found at dawn. They'd attack at irregular intervals, never letting German troops rest or establish routines. Sometimes they'd probe defences for hours without launching a serious attack, forcing Germans to remain at high alert until exhaustion set in, then hit them with a real assault. The most feared Soviet tactic was the night raid. Small groups, sometimes just 3 or 4 men, would infiltrate German lines after dark. Their missions varied. Sometimes they'd capture prisoners for interrogation, targeting officers when possible. Sometimes they'd mine German positions, placing explosives on timers to detonate at dawn. Sometimes they'd simply sow chaos, throwing grenades into dugouts, shooting into groups of soldiers, then disappearing into the darkness before organised resistance could form. The psychological effect was devastating. German troops never felt safe, even in rear areas. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by alerts and attacks. Fatigue accumulated, judgment deteriorated, casualties mounted from mistakes born of exhaustion. German accounts from October and November 1942 show increasing signs of psychological strain. A lieutenant in the 94th Infantry Division wrote to his family describing Stalingrad as a place where normal combat rules didn't apply. You can't see the enemy until they're on top of you. You hear Russian voices in the darkness, gunfire echoes from every direction. You don't know if you're shooting at enemies or your own men. Yesterday, Schmidt was killed by a Soviet soldier who'd been hiding in the rubble for 2 days, living among corpses, waiting for an opportunity. How do you fight an enemy like that? We can destroy their positions, kill everyone we can find, and the next day more appear. It's like fighting ghosts. The industrial district battles that consumed October and November saw these tactics reach their ultimate expression. The 3 massive factory complexes, Dzerzhinsky, Barricade and Red October, were steel and concrete fortresses, their machine shops and assembly halls creating vast indoor battlefields. The Germans committed their best remaining troops, including elements of the 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions converted to infantry due to tank losses. The Luftwaffe flew thousands of sorties, dropping so many bombs that the ground shook continuously. Yet, the Soviets held on, fighting from the rubble of buildings designed to withstand industrial accidents, now repurposed as fortifications. The Barricadi factory battle exemplified the savagery of this phase. The complex covered over 200 acres, a maze of buildings, tunnels, and rail lines. Soviet defenders, primarily the 138th Rifle Division and elements of the 95th Rifle Division, occupied the ruins with orders to hold at any cost. The Germans attacked on October 14th with overwhelming force, supported by over 300 aircraft and concentrated artillery that fired over 50,000 shells in a single day. The bombardment was so intense that Soviet troops in the factory reported being unable to see more than a few meters through the dust and smoke. Buildings collapsed, burying defenders alive. Communications were impossible. Units were isolated, fighting independently. Yet, they held. When German infantry advanced into the ruins, expecting to find only corpses, they encountered organized resistance from Soviets who'd survived in cellars and basements. The fighting dissolved into hundreds of individual battles for rooms, corridors, and machinery pits. A German assault gun, a Stuggy 3, penetrated deep into the factory complex, supporting infantry clearing buildings. Soviet anti-tank troops shadowed it for hours, waiting for an opportunity. When it stopped to support an attack, they rushed it from 3 directions with Molotov cocktails and magnetic mines. The vehicle burned, blocking a key corridor and isolating the German troops who'd advanced beyond it. Private Gennady Ivanov, fighting in the Barricadi factory with the 138th Rifle Division, described the confusion and terror of the battle. You lost all sense of time and space. Was it day or night? Were you in building 12 or 17? Who held the room you'd occupied an hour ago? Nobody knew. You fought until you ran out of ammunition, then scavenged weapons from the dead. German or Soviet, it didn't matter. I used a German MP-40 submachine gun for 2 days because it was better than nothing. Food and water were whatever you could find. We drank from puddles, ate raw grain from storage bins. Some men went insane from the stress and isolation. One soldier in my platoon, Yegorov, just started laughing one morning and couldn't stop. He walked out into the open, still laughing, and was shot. I think part of him wanted it to end. The factory battles introduced a new level of vertical warfare. The multi-story buildings meant combat occurred simultaneously on multiple levels. Soviet troops on upper floors would rain grenades down on Germans below. Germans would blast through floors with explosives, dropping into rooms of surprised Soviet defenders. Staircases became death traps, swept by machine gun fire from both directions. Elevators, where they still functioned, were never used because they were obvious kill zones. Instead, soldiers climbed through ventilation shafts, blew holes through walls, rappelled down exteriors using cables and ropes. The Soviets discovered that the factory's industrial infrastructure could be weaponized. Overhead cranes could be rigged to collapse on advancing Germans. Vats of chemicals could be used as improvised explosives or incendiaries. Railway cars on internal tracks could be rolled into German positions. One particularly clever Soviet engineer rigged a factory's remaining electric power to create improvised traps, electrifying doorways and metal rails that Germans might use for cover. The effectiveness was limited, but the psychological impact was significant. Every piece of equipment, every structure became potentially lethal. By early November, the German Sixth Army had pushed the Soviets back to a strip of land along the Volga that was, in places, less than 300 yards deep. German soldiers could throw rocks into the river from their positions. The end seemed inevitable. Paulus reported to Hitler that final victory was days away. Intelligence estimated that Soviet forces in Stalingrad were down to 30,000 effectives, outnumbered 3-1, with no reserves and limited supplies. What the Germans didn't know was that the Soviets were counting on their defense of the city as a holding action, while massive forces accumulated for a counter-offensive that would change everything. The supply situation for the 62nd Army was desperate but not impossible. The Volga crossings, though under constant fire, continued every night. Specialized river flotilla troops, many of them veterans of pre-war river transport, navigated the dark waters with a combination of skill and fatalism. They knew the currents, knew where German fire was heaviest, knew how to time runs to minimize exposure. Losses were horrific. The river flotilla lost over 1,000 boats and barges during the battle, along with thousands of sailors and boatmen. But supplies got through. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement weapons, and most importantly reinforcements. The reinforcements by November were different from the elite guards divisions of September. These were standard rifle divisions, sometimes under strength, sometimes poorly equipped, always desperately needed. The 45th Rifle Division crossed on November 10th, thrown immediately into combat at the Red October factory. The 149th Independent Rifle Brigade arrived on November 18th, literally hours before Operation Uranus launched. These units lacked the training and cohesion of Guards formations, but they had something equally valuable. They were fresh troops taking over from divisions that had been fighting continuously for months. The Germans, meanwhile, had no fresh troops, no replacements beyond the minimal trickle that came down the long supply line from Germany. Soviet artillery, positioned on the eastern bank of the Volga, played a crucial role that's often overlooked. These guns couldn't effectively support attacks in the ruins because German and Soviet positions were too intermingled. But they could interdict German supply routes, hit concentrations of German troops forming up for attacks, and most importantly, they could fire massed bombardments at critical moments. When the Guards first crossed in September, Soviet artillery fired over 10,000 shells in support, suppressing German positions along the riverbank. Throughout the battle, artillery fire kept German forces off balance, disrupted their logistics, and inflicted steady casualties. The Soviet Air Force, decimated in 1941, had rebuilt sufficiently by late 1942 to contest German air superiority over Stalingrad. They couldn't match the Luftwaffe in numbers or quality, but they didn't need to. Even small numbers of Soviet fighters forced German bombers to fly higher, reducing accuracy. Soviet night bombers, primarily the famous Po-2 biplanes flown by women's regiments, harassed German positions constantly. These slow, fabric-covered aircraft were nearly impossible to intercept at night. They'd fly low over German lines, dropping small bombs and flares, making sleep impossible for German troops. The damage they inflicted was minimal, but the psychological wear was significant. German logistics became increasingly strained as the battle dragged through October and November. The Sixth Army required 700 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat effectiveness. It was receiving on average 500 tons. The deficit meant rationing ammunition, fuel, and food. Vehicles were cannibalized for parts. Wounded soldiers remained in the line because there weren't enough replacements. Horses were slaughtered for meat. The vaunted Wehrmacht supply system, which had supported offensives across thousands of miles, was breaking down under the strain of urban combat where every shell, every bullet, every bandage had to be carried forward through rubble-choked streets under constant sniper fire. Soviet logistics faced similar challenges but had one critical advantage. Their supply lines, though exposed to German fire, were much shorter. Supplies moved across the Volga from depots that were only miles away, constantly stocked by rail lines stretching back to Soviet factories. German supplies came from depots hundreds of miles away, down roads and rail lines that were increasingly attacked by Soviet partisans and air raids. The Germans needed gasoline to bring up more gasoline. The Soviets just needed boats and brave men to sail them. The arrival of winter in November began tilting conditions further in Soviet favour. The first snows fell on November 15th, temperatures dropping below freezing. German troops still wearing summer and autumn uniforms suffered. The Wehrmacht had been assured the war would be over before winter. It had issued winter clothing, but most was still in depots far from the front or had been diverted to Army Group Centre, fighting before Moscow. Soldiers stuffed newspapers under their uniforms for insulation, wrapped feet in rags, shared blankets. Frostbite casualties mounted. Weapons froze and malfunctioned. Vehicle engines wouldn't start without being warmed for hours. Soviet troops were better prepared. They had winter clothing, felt boots, fur hats. They knew how to keep weapons functioning in cold weather, how to build fires that wouldn't give away positions, how to survive temperatures that German soldiers from temperate climates had never experienced. Moreover, the cold and snow provided advantages in combat. Snow-muffled sound, making infiltration easier. Cold air was denser, allowing sound to carry further, meaning Soviet soldiers could hear German movements and conversations from greater distances. The white landscape made camouflage easier for defenders who knew the terrain. On November 19, 1942, while German troops in Stalingrad fought for the last few hundred yards to the Volga, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus. Over 1,000 Soviet troops, supported by 13,000 artillery pieces and over 1,000 tanks, smashed through Romanian armies protecting the German flanks north and south of Stalingrad. The Romanian forces, poorly equipped and demoralized, collapsed within hours. Soviet mobile groups, tank and cavalry corps, drove deep into the German rear, heading for a link-up at Kalach, 40 miles west of Stalingrad. If they succeeded, the entire Sixth Army would be encircled. In Stalingrad itself, the defenders knew nothing of the offensive at first. They continued fighting as they had for months, contesting buildings and rooms, dying in anonymous ruins. Then, on November 21st, officers began noticing something strange. German attacks were losing intensity, artillery fire was decreasing, German troops seemed distracted, uncertain. Rumours spread among Soviet soldiers that something was happening, something big, but orders were to continue holding positions. Finally, on November 23rd, official word came down through channels. The Sixth Army was surrounded. Soviet forces had linked up at Kalach. Every German soldier in Stalingrad was trapped. The reaction among Soviet troops was euphoria mixed with disbelief. They had fought for so long, suffered so much, watched friends and comrades die in such numbers, all to prevent the city's fall. Now suddenly they had won. Not just held, but won. The Germans were surrounded, cut off, facing the same desperate situation the Soviets had endured for months, except the Germans had no Volga to supply them, no endless reserves of manpower to draw on, no industrial base producing weapons by the millions behind them. German troops in Stalingrad reacted with shock. Many refused to believe the encirclement reports at first. When the truth became undeniable, reactions varied. Some veterans who'd survived previous encirclements in Russia believed they could break out or be relieved. Others, seeing the exhaustion and depleted strength of their units, knew they were doomed. Paulus requested permission to break out while the Soviet ring was still weak, but Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to hold position. The Luftwaffe would supply them by air, he promised. Relief forces would break through within weeks. The air supply operation was a catastrophic failure from the start. The Sixth Army needed 700 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe managed at best 100 tons on good days. Often weather prevented flying entirely. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns shot down transports by the dozen. Supplies that did arrive were often useless. Winter uniforms in wrong sizes, ammunition for weapons that units no longer had, luxury items instead of food and medicine. Soldiers joked bitterly about receiving crates of contraceptives and spices while they starved. For Soviet troops in Stalingrad, the encirclement changed everything. They were no longer fighting a desperate defensive battle against overwhelming odds. They were part of a larger offensive, besiegers rather than besieged. The psychological transformation was immediate. Units that had barely held together through October and November suddenly found new energy. They began attacking, pushing German troops back from the Volga, reclaiming ruins they'd yielded months earlier. The Germans, weakened by supply shortages and the knowledge of their situation, fought with decreasing effectiveness. Through December and January, the 62nd Army systematically compressed the German pocket. They weren't alone. Other Soviet armies joined the inner encirclement ring, but the 62nd had special motivation. These were the men who'd held when everyone else said it was impossible, who'd fought in hell and survived. Now they were delivering justice. The Guards divisions, rebuilt to partial strength with replacements, led many of the attacks. The 13th Guards, reduced to 2,000 men in September, now at 7,000 with replacements, and recovered wounded, attacked toward Mamayev-Kurgan again. This time they weren't fighting uphill against prepared defences. They were attacking Germans in makeshift positions, starving, freezing, out of ammunition. The German defence of the pocket was doomed, but not ineffective. They were professionals, even in defeat. They created defensive lines from the rubble, concentrated their remaining tanks and assault guns at key points, rationed ammunition to make every shot count. Soviet attacks still paid heavy prices, but the outcome was never in doubt. Every day the pocket shrank. Every day German combat strength decreased. Every day the end came closer. By late January 1943, the Sixth Army had been split into isolated pockets, unable to support each other, running out of everything. Paulus had been promoted to Field Marshal, Hitler's way of reminding him that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear: fight to the death or commit suicide. Paulus, watching his men die from starvation, frostbite and Soviet attacks, chose a third option. On February 2nd, 1943, he surrendered the southern pocket. The northern pocket, under General Strecker, held out one more day before surrendering on February 3rd. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The German Sixth Army, 22 divisions totaling over 290,000 men at the time of encirclement, ceased to exist. Approximately 91,000 survivors marched into Soviet captivity. Most would die in the camps over the next years. Of the 91,000 captured, only about 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The Luftwaffe had lost over 500 transport and bomber aircraft, losses that crippled its operational capability. Germany's Axis allies, Romania, Italy and Hungary, lost entire armies, their faith in German victory shattered. Soviet casualties were staggering. The 62nd Army alone suffered over 200,000 casualties during the defensive battle. Total Soviet losses in the Stalingrad area, including the encirclement operation and final reduction of the pocket, exceeded 100,000 killed, wounded and missing. But the Soviet Union had the manpower and industrial capacity to absorb such losses. Germany did not. The Guards divisions that crossed the Volga in September had accomplished their mission beyond anyone's expectations. They hadn't just held Stalingrad, they'd transformed it from defensive necessity into offensive opportunity. Their sacrifice, their tactical innovations, their refusal to yield, had bought time for the Soviet Union to prepare its counteroffensive. When that counteroffensive came, it destroyed an entire German army and turned the tide of the war. In the years after Stalingrad, the Soviet Guards expanded dramatically. By 1945, there would be Guards armies, Guards tank armies, entire formations bearing the elite designation. The standards remained high. Units earned Guard status through exceptional combat performance, not through political connections or favoritism. The Guards who fought at Stalingrad set the template for what Soviet elite units should be. Aggressive, skilled in close combat, willing to take casualties to accomplish missions, ideologically committed to defeating fascism. The tactical lessons of Stalingrad influenced urban warfare doctrine worldwide. The storm group concept, the emphasis on small unit independence, the vertical warfare through buildings, all became standard techniques. Military academies studied Stalingrad for decades, trying to understand how defenders held against such overwhelming force. The answers were complex, involving terrain, logistics, tactics, leadership, and the desperation of fighting with nowhere to retreat. But fundamentally, Stalingrad proved that in urban combat, determination and tactical skill could overcome material superiority. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became the symbol of resistance, the turning point when defeat became victory. Every Soviet citizen knew the story of how the Guards crossed the Volga, how they held against impossible odds, how their sacrifice led to triumph. The city was rebuilt after the war, transformed into a showpiece of Soviet achievement. The ruins were cleared, modern buildings rose, but memorials mark the places where the fiercest fighting occurred. Mamayev Kurgan became a massive memorial complex, the Motherland Call's statue towering over the city, a reminder of those who died to save it. For Germany, Stalingrad became the symbol of hubris and defeat. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe, which had seemed unstoppable, had been stopped and destroyed in the ruins of a single city. The myth of German military invincibility died in those ruins. After Stalingrad, German soldiers knew they could lose, that Soviet soldiers were not the subhumans Nazi propaganda portrayed, that the war might end in defeat. Morale never fully recovered. The Eastern Front, which had seemed a path to living space and resources, became a meat grinder consuming German strength with nothing to show for it. The veterans of the Stalingrad defense carried physical and psychological scars for life. Many were wounded multiple times, bore shrapnel in their bodies that couldn't be removed, limped from poorly healed fractures, coughed from lungs damaged by smoke and chemical fumes. The psychological wounds were deeper: nightmares, survivor's guilt, an inability to explain to those who hadn't been there what the battle was actually like. A veteran of the 13th Guards, interviewed in the 1970s, tried to describe it. You can talk about the tactics, the weapons, the casualties. You can't describe what it felt like to know you'd probably die that day, and the next, and the next. To watch friends disappear, whole platoons wiped out in minutes, to see things no human should see. I was 19 when I crossed the Volga. I came back a 50-year-old man in a 19-year-old body. We won, and I'm proud of that. But the cost was everything. The Soviet guards who entered Stalingrad in September 1942 changed history. Not through brilliant strategy or technological superiority, but through sheer determination to hold ground that any rational assessment said couldn't be held. They fought in conditions that broke lesser men, suffered casualties that would have shattered most units, and accomplished a mission that experts said was impossible. When the final Germans surrendered on February 3, 1943, the victory belonged to them as much as to the generals who planned the encirclement or the millions of soldiers who executed it. They had held when holding mattered most, and in doing so, they turned the tide of World War II.